The new constitution also includes something that was not there before, that Russia is a union federation of many nations. Indeed, for the first time it was admitted that Russia is a federation of a huge number of different nationalities, not just Russians. In practice, this does not give many rights. It is a record, although there are some autonomy. The wounds of the Mongols are still festering. They suffered the most. Many wounds fester. The sad truth is that these nations have been pitted and incited against each other for the last several decades, for many different reasons, which of course include money and power, as well as historical memory. People in this part of the world are unforgiving, so it's really hard to convince them to love each other. I believe that since we must learn about the French Revolution, which gave nothing to the world except genocide. The English gave much more, or revolutions from both Americas. It will not hurt the French if they learn the nationalities of at least the most important ones from Russia. The West needs it, because they look at Russia through their own prism. Unitary states, but here the majority of nations are people from Transcaucasia and the steppe. These people, unlike Europeans, have a good memory. They can be grateful and hospitable, but also respond when someone starts jumping on their head. These people don't make assumptions. I'll say sorry and everything will be fine again. What actually happened? I just called someone out, beat up. I'll do it again in a moment. It's a different matter. These people prefer actions over words. It became more severe in the era of Stalinism, when these people were forced to completely change their way of life, even brutally. Language and writing were imposed. These people finally prefer one strong leader and have their own rules. They don't negotiate. If they say something, they do it. In the West, the word has no meaning anymore. And it would be useful for Europeans who are planning to go anywhere to the East to remember this, because there, indeed, people disappear and pay for mistakes. That's the problem in itself. It is recorded, but there have been conflicts between these nations for centuries, but it was especially shown with the First World War. Some began to set these nations against each other. Of course it was manipulated to destroy power. Only it was not stopped in time after the overthrow of power. These people remember it perfectly. These people remember it perfectly. The overthrow of power, of course, does nothing, because nowadays, when there is no dynastic monarchy, there are systemically prepared successors. Some minister will jump on the stool. That'll happen in any system. World change. Now is not time for mourning for the ruler. Now the power is to be permanent. Even Great Britain. It changed the law, and yes, we have an official coronation, but legal prerogatives come with the death of the predecessor. Lenin's death changed nothing, and introduced an even worse creation. Added to this, these days are nations that have really suffered a lot from each other. Only a moron who has no idea about political systems, history and this part of the world can talk like that. It would be an apocalypse. A civil war would be unleashed, which for economic reasons would turn into a global one on a huge scale. Inevitably, those people who, let's be honest, suffered ethnic cleansing, not so long ago, because Stalin had not left long ago, would be settling the score. No, because the Europeans have no idea about it, and for them it is even unimaginable. Their revolutions murdered, but always in the end people accepted a leader and relative peace followed. They accepted because they were a homogeneous nation. Even if there were minorities, they were assimilated. Here many minorities were so different from the capital, and were often in the majority but so much different from the government, that there are no characteristics that could unite these people except through a strong leader. These Russians, in the sense of Russian nationality, not citizenship, live up to the Urals. And this is also not in most and not always on the territory of the state of Russia. Many are in Belarus, in Ukraine. There is something else that is not mentioned, but it added fuel to the fire. Perestroika. The way citizenship was granted after the collapse of the Soviet Union. You were given citizenship as you had registration at the time. Where were you at the moment? A person with Latvian citizenship does not have to be a Latvian, but a Russian who worked there at the time and got stuck, although he did not want to. Because suddenly new countries were created and often these people could not leave, because their status suddenly became unknown. The same we could say about Latvian, who at that moment was in Russia. Even now acts of born are printed with the entry of the city, but with the name of the country that is currently in that territory. Famous boxer siblings. They both have a different country of birth, although they are not related to either. My parents worked there. At the moment, they were born there. Yes, entered. It's a huge mess that you can write about endlessly. Countries had to create their legal acts. We're talking republics, not satellites. These were self-contained states simply in an alliance. The joke was also granting citizenship to those who emigrated according to the new republics. For example, because the lands that belonged to my grandfather were on the border. My father could apply for citizenship of Lithuania and Belarus, as well as Russia, but due to history, this last one was impossible, although he was any of them. Whites can come to Russia for longer only from 2015. For the trip probably since 2008 without problems. The border simply passed through the town. His sister had the Soviet Union, then Belarus in paper. Grandpa had many countries in papers when he was trying to return to home, which none of us can complete. Problems with the archives because some of the documents are here and some are there. They don't even know where. Better to hire a lawyer for this. Of course, it settled down and changed over time, but that was the beginning. I think it's a huge plus that I can finally see the Romanov wedding in the former Tsar's cathedral. It is very good that we can finally show our descendants the country, even on a trip. Previously, it was threatened by Siberia. It was very difficult, and even if someone succeeded, he was surrounded by the GRU and all services. Every move had to be analyzed. I think it's wonderful that this mummy, which was already falling apart, called Lenin, which had little of this Lenin, was taken out of the Kremlin and there is no change of guard there. It is the merit of this power. Whether anyone likes it or not. It's good that the Tsar found a proper burial, but we would still like to know what really happened in Ipatiev's house. These documents, as well as the subsequent finding of Maria and Alexei's corpses at a great distance, as if they were running away, raise questions about the official version. After all, long time was believed that they were alive for. The death of the Tsar is the greatest criminal mystery on a global scale today. He was recognized as a saint and everyone is afraid to enter into the competence of the Orthodox Church. It is also a question of symbolism, whether it is better to give people Nicholas or Stalin. Definitely no one wants to give Stalin, although the Jugashvili family has a huge political position further away. The nation needs someone to relate to. The Tsar with his weaknesses is much better. Ukrainians will certainly not eat Europe, as has been said in some EU countries, which have forgotten that for centuries they have eaten the nations living on that territory to the last bone. However, there is something to remember when looking at Russia and the republics it has spawned. First of all, people there, unlike Europeans, have very good memories. The current situation has been a disaster and this conflict, even because it is fratricidal, will certainly give rise to many conflicts in the future. There is also something that the West has been fooling about for centuries. This is due to lack of knowledge of this part of the world. It's definitely not the wilderness. These lands established close contact with the West under Tsar Peter the Great. He also abolished the tirem, the Orthodox equivalent of the harem. It cannot be ignored that literature from these areas, as well as painting, influenced European culture, and European culture influenced the culture of Russia and the republics that emerged. All these countries have theater and art schools at a very high level. Of course, what the cinematography produces is a relative matter, but certainly films such as Tomiris are more historically accurate than American ones. Yes, it is a legend. There is always a grain of truth in the legend, although Iran suffered torture because of that film. What I mean is that no one with a branded watch runs on set. This is truly a world-class production. Unfortunately, most of these countries, apart from Russia, have a very low cinema budget. That's why few of these productions go abroad. It would be a good idea for people to also watch the film about Genghis Khan, the Mongol. Unfortunately, it never got a sequel. If someone is unable to read an academic textbook about the Mongols and repeat idiocy about murder over and over again, treating historical events through the primacy of contemporary mentality. Also forgetting that the chronicles, like social media, were a propaganda tool, and in this case it was to everyone's advantage to inflate the numbers. There are some really tough people living on the steppe. All these nations would revolt if the only thing their ruler had to offer them was the murder of their countrymen. Let them cry like the lady whose everyone knows, with the quote that, in Europe, these matters are resolved through polite conversation. What we can read that outside Europe, let's murder each other as much as possible, because there are worse people there. Very interesting ideology, isn't it? Nowadays circus and ballet arts come from these lands. There is indeed a problem in perception, and I am reminded of the famous speech of Catherine the Great to Paul III, who, as we know, was a huge admirer of Frederick the Great. And introducing Europeanness, whatever that meant then and today. Catherine finally began to ask calmly, "Do you think the Kyrgyz are Europeans?" Answer: no. Or maybe Mongols? Indeed, their facial features are so European. No. So maybe the Circassians, whose women have been most prized in harems for centuries because of their beauty and cool demeanor? No. So maybe Chukchi, Yakuts, Georgians, Armenians, Chechens, Kazakhs, Tatars, here's the whole list, of course. No, so go away with that Europe, there is no Europe here. This is the crux of the matter. Europeans think that Russia is European, but this is not entirely true. You could say that this European Russia is the territory to the Urals. That is, a piece of Russia and republics such as Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. The Balts are not ethnically related to Russians, perhaps they are not even Slavs. And here again, this will not be a completely adequate division. Let's not forget that Russia's new shape came very recently, in the 1990s. People traveled to various parts of the country for work. During perestroika, citizenship was assigned according to the place of residence at a given time, often cutting people off from their families, making even difficult for them to return to their hometowns. People married among themselves. Contrary to the ideology of ancient Slavs currently circulating around the world, there are no more ethnically mixed nations than the Slavic ones. Many won't like it, but it's true. I'm afraid that in Europe there's no clean nation. Indeed, these Russians, who are really Russians from the boyar people, from grandfather to grandfather, can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Not to mention the fact that most oligarchs are Jews or Germans. Even in the era of Tsarism, the Germans were doing great in business in Russia. Stalin was a Georgian, which everyone seemed to forget during World War II. That's certainly why he managed to be the only one well-informed in this game and win the war. Stalin did not negotiate and was not bothered by the fact that 15-year-olds went to war. Just like Hitler. On Caucasus negotiation not exist. Since the long times, there was a rule in the Russian army that mostly native Russians were commanders. With the development of technology, they are less often on the front lines and only make plans. Those exiled to Siberia were sent to do dirty work on the front lines to get rid of the problem. People from remote villages, uneducated, were sent to get rid of the problem. We all know the story of the Kalashnikov. Whether it was really his idea, or not is a relative matter, of 90% of patents in the world even now. According to the principle, first come, first served. Also the fact that people have always copied good things to their civilizations, from other civilizations. Today, when asked about the origin of silk, most people will answer China, although it is a Korean invention. It is an undeniable fact that this spring changed the armed world. Although the designs were made by his wife, he couldn't do it. However, there were only a handful of those who survived and made it. Finally, people were sent from those nationalities that were the most troublesome, often only historically, because everything was done to break their spirit, but troublesome. So I'm not surprised that some of these soldiers really have no idea where they are. Because it's a miracle if they have secondary school. Americans are not saints in these matters either. They also try to send people to the front line who had rather low education and whose towns are godforsaken places with no future. It is not surprising that these people do not know that they cannot buy a roll at 12 noon in a Muslim country. The troops, composed of Native Americans during IIWW, were treated very poorly, even though it was their languages that helped destroy the Enigma. These educated people with guns rarely run, they are away from much more important matters. However, few people bother to read the names when they destroy Soviet cemeteries in defense of Ukraine. In some areas, people destroy the grave of a Ukrainian more often than a Russian. It is worth checking what nationality the unit consisted of. Apart from the fact that, in accordance with all international legal conventions, war cemeteries are not destroyed. Does anyone like it or not? The fronts were divided by the big three, and you can blame them, although, funnily enough, everyone is allied with at least one of them. Not to mention that it is dangerous not only for hygienic reasons, but these are usually places after bloody battles, and the removal of unexploded ordnance after a war varies all over the world. Generally bad. Another problem in this part of the world is that most republics are not designated according to nationality. The best example here will again be the Mongols who live in Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, of course Mongolia, but many more of them can sometimes be found in urbanized Kazakhstan, and Inner Mongolia, i.e. China. Many nations were promised republics but did not receive them. This gives rise to contemporary conflicts. Some nations have been merged with their enemies into one country, and this also creates conflicts. Maybe that was the goal, conflicts. Another problem in this part of the world is that most republics are not designated according to nationality. The best example here will again be the Mongols who live in Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, of course Mongolia, but many more of them can sometimes be found in urbanized Kazakhstan, and Inner Mongolia, i.e. China. Many nations were promised republics but did not receive them. This gives rise to contemporary conflicts. Some nations have been merged with their enemies into one country, and this also creates conflicts. Maybe that was the goal, conflicts. A federation of nations, a union of nations, is it even possible without the supremacy of one side? Of course not. Colossuses always stand on wobbly legs. The European Union with German supremacy is also not sacred. In fact, the German Empire was changing. This was most visible during the pandemic, when countries found themselves in a difficult situation instead of supporting each other, because that was the idea of the EU. They quickly closed their borders. Germany in particular has caused and continues to cause all sorts of problems for foreign workers, even those who have worked there seasonally for years. Or they crossed borders every day to go to work. The Germans were incited by Denmark to introduce restrictions, which is not surprising, because they are actually one nation. It has thus proven that it is an unnecessary institution which mostly decided if tomato is vegetable or fruit, but not about important things. And has long not been what it was supposed to be according to its founders, such as Otto von Habsburg. It also failed at the beginning of the conflict. You can even say it directly, using bad words. The Germans chose their people, i.e. rich or connected oligarchs. However, they did not allow the rest, even those who had family in Germany, to use other types of COVID vaccines. Basically, let poverty stay among the poor. Contrary to appearances, it was Attila, Genghis Khan and Alexandros who built empires that were based on the consolidation of dependencies, not on murder, although these always accompany every conflict and conquest, but more on that another time. Maybe someone will finally look at a good academic book, not written as propaganda, and read it for themselves. Even a confession. There was religious freedom in the Mongol Empire. They hated them so much that they sent Benedict the Pole, Marco Polo and William. The chronicles write about the murders of Christians, but these were not religious murders. There were murders between nations. Shamanists, Buddhists, Muslims and Christians were also killed if they came into conflict, but these are not religious conflicts, but war conflicts with the nationality that happens to follow this religion. You wouldn't find such tolerance in Europe at that time. Of course, Europe has never met Mongols, and it's time to end this interchangeable use of the vocabulary, Mongol or Tartar. They are completely different nations. They fought with them, but much more often used them as mercenaries and achieved their goals. But first, let's touch on other topics. In this painting it's a reference to Tengri. They won't understand.